Parts that we need to start assemble the engine block is here, and we take out some tools that we're going to need, some basic tools, and we put a few parts close by that we need right away. So now we're going to start by first install the main bearings, and then we're going to check the crankshaft end float, make sure is correct with the new bearings installed. This is the direction to get to Techniques Auto, and we're using TCD. Here we're going past the TCD, and we're going to take a right onto Court Street, which is right here. And we'll go all the way over. So now we are at Dundonald Street and Court Street, and I'm turning onto Dundonald Street. Now we're going to go past the Liberty Theatre, or the BIU, and the New Testament Church there on the left. And right at the top of Dundonald Street and King Street, we're going to take a left. And onto King Street. Now we turn right onto Curvin Avenue. And this is Techniques Auto. There we have an impact gun, rings, piston ring squeezer, oil can, screwdriver, a speed handle, and we have a puller to remove the timing gear, and we also have the feeler gauge, torque wrench, and a dial gauge to check the end float. And there is the piston holder. And here is the engine block, all prepped and ready. And if you notice, underneath we have a piece of cloth touching the metal and getting scrape or anything like that. And then we have some bearings and piston rings right there. And those are the parts we need right at this moment. So, we don't have to put everything right there right now. Okay, now I'm just taking out the main bearing caps. And remember, we're keeping them in order because we want them to go back the same place because they are line bored. And if you mix them up, you will run into big trouble with the crankshaft can't turn when you tighten it up, even if the bearing and the crank correct. If you mix up the cap, then you'll have big problem, and sometimes difficult to sort it out. So from the initial pull down of the engine you mark them if they don't already come with a number and an arrow. So you're going to mark which one it is and which direction it go, even though you have a lip inside for the bearing. This is the new bearings, and I want to be careful when you're taking them out. You don't want they get damaged. And this too is the truss washer, is the center bearing with the truss washer, the side piece here. The truss washer built onto the bearing. If you notice how these bearings are, and then this of the side. So this is what determines the amount of end crankshaft and float. With the bearings, there's two things you gotta always keep an eye on. It's not all bearings come with these holes that let oil inside the bearing to lubricate the crank and the bearing. Some engine, the top, the bearing that go in the cap don't have any hole for the oil, and while the piece that go in the engine block of the oil, and if you mix them the wrong way, then you will block the oil from going inside the bearing to lubricate the crank. So this is an important thing you have to keep note of. Come over with the camera. And if you look right in here, that's the oil gallery that bring in oil from the oil pump. And it also circulates in this vein. That's why you need these two holes for the oil that come up in here to come through and lubricate the bearing and the crank. So a lot of the stuff we're doing now go for any engine, not just a BMW M10 engine. And these are just basic principles where after practicing it over and over, it just becomes automatic. You just check for that stuff without even thinking about it. So the first thing I'm doing now, I'm just going to put in this truss washer, this bearing with the truss washer. And if you notice, there's a lip on the bearing right there. Well, we want to make sure it go into this lip. This is the locking lip that stops the bearing from turning. Normally, we're going to come from this side, and I'll even it up, then slide it in. And I'm keep pushing it until my finger actually flush. So only because I'm making the only because we're doing the video while I'm talking about it. Normally all this stuff, I just do it without even thinking about it. So now the bearing is flush, so that's our first bearing in. Now I'm going to put the bearing inside the engine block. But remember, we always have to keep attention where this lip is. And also, you have to always double check what the size of the bearing. So this bearing, you see it marked right there. STD. Very difficult for your seat, but it's right there. STD. And that's the abbreviation, it's right here. See it clear right there? You see? Okay. So it's STD, and that's the abbreviation for standard, meaning the crankshaft not machined to a oversized, to an undersize. and it's the same size as what it come from in the factory. So now why you have to look, keep attention to that lip is, for example, there's one lip here, one cut for the lip, the locking lip for the bearing to go in, but there's none over this side. You don't want to put the lip over there, because some engine it will actually allow you to put it in until you tighten the crank, then you realize, oh, the crank lock. So you want it right over where it's supposed to be. And then we'll actually line it up flush and then slide it in from this side. And I just put a little pressure on it, and I could just feel it, that ever so slight feeling in my finger when the two different metal become even. And then I'm checking it over here and it's even over there. Now I'm going to put in another bearing. And same way I'm checking for the lip first of all. There we line it up. And there you go. Now I'm just lubricating the bearings. And remember, this has to be very clean. You can't have no dust, no dirt, nothing inside the bearing at this point. And we're going to do a separate video on how to measure the clearance with a plastic tape for the crank. So we're just concentrating on this bearing now, installation. And the reason we're lubricating the bearing like this, we don't want the bearing to get any form of damage, and we want to get a nice free rotation on the crank when we put the caps on. So it just can't have too much oil. Just put as much oil as you want. And we're doing all the journals. Okay. And notice I still keep cleaning my hand. And in this stage of the work, you want to be careful with the type of rag you use. You don't want to use certain type of material because they can make a problem for the engine. So you don't want to use any form of cotton or silk. Something like rayon, different materials that not leaving a lot of foreign small particles behind. Now I'm going to install the crank. And you want to be careful this time. You want to make sure you're going down nice and straight. And there we go. Then we're going to add some more oil to it again. So as I said before, it can't have too much oil. More oil the better. But at this point you don't have to concentrate too much on the connecting rod journal, because we're mainly concentrating on the main bearing journal. And if you notice, we're starting from this direction, and I'm going to look where the lip is, and you want the two lips on the same side. So one lip is here, and this lip, we want it that way, same size. And what happens, one bearing lock the other, and vice versa. If it go the other way, then the bearing will rotate eventually, and then go bad. So that's why you have the two locking lips on the same side. So we're going to just add a little more oil in here. And you notice I still wiping my finger before I go in the bearing, because I don't want no dust. Then I'm making sure it's on the locking side. And I'm actually just catching the nuts. I'm not going to tighten them just yet. Now I'm putting in the bolts, the main bearing cap bolts, and we actually clean the threads so we can get a nice smooth without any form of damage. So I'm just going to use a speed bar. You have many different ways to run down the bolts. I like to use a speed bar because I can actually go down fast, and then I can start to feel if there's any resistance whatsoever. Using the impact gun is not good, because you can't really sense when there's danger. And you want to bring it down even, so I'm bringing down that a little, and this a little, and this a little, and I can feel it reach. And we're going to repeat the process. And I'm not tightening them because these we want to torque them and make sure they torque at the correct spec. So I'm bring down a little, and I could feel it right down. So I pull on it just a touch. And that's the first down. Then now, sorry, a lot of other guys working. We gotta still make our video. Now I can rotate the crank, and it's rotate nice. There's no resistance on the crank. So this, if the bearing not correct, you wouldn't able to do this. So we're going to torque it and then check it again to make sure it rotating nice and smooth. Now I'm going to look for the specification of how much the crankshaft need to be tightened or torqued. But first, even though these gloves is pretty good, I got to take it off, because you want to take care of your books, or if you're using the computer, you don't want to fill the thing up with grease, or in the book 1 year, 2 years from now, the book full with so much grease and dirt you can't read nothing in it. So you have to take extra precaution. So we're going to look for our specs for the crankshaft. First thing is our end float. So it's a 0, So 850. So I'm looking for the specs for the crankshaft, how much to tighten it. And we're underneath crankshaft, but there's nothing in there regarding the specs, so we're going over torque wrench setting. And there we are, main bearing cap to engine block bolts. And that's our measurement there. Okay, so we have two different tools here to use to tighten the crankshaft cap bolts. We have a torque wrench and we have a point wrench. The point wrench, I always prefer it. I feel that it's much more accurate. But the torque wrench is a more modern tool. It's also accurate, but I prefer this one. This torque wrench is actually over 30 years. This is my first torque wrench I buy to rebuild my first engine when I change from the garage that I learned mechanic. And I remember this torque wrench, when I go to the other garage, I didn't have enough tool because I'm a young mechanic and don't have all the necessary tool you need. And I was rebuilding a Subaru engine and I needed a torque wrench. And none of the senior guys would lend me the torque wrench because they kind of pissed off that I just come and I get a big job to rebuild an engine and they make up their mind they're not lending me the torque wrench. So I go hunting to find, the cheapest wrench I could find. And this is it. And 30 years later, I still have it. So it's just a little history on this tool here. As a mechanic, you gotta take care of the tools. And as we say before, it's not every modern technology we choose to move with it, because we have experience. We know some stuff don't work even though someone might try to experiment with it. So we love our old-fashioned point wrench, but for you guys' sake, I'm going to go with the torque wrench today. Okay, so now our specs, the specs on the torque specs for the main bearing is 60 Newton meter. And the torque wrench, it should have Newton meter, yes it does. So there is our Newton meter. So we're not going to give it the full 60, we're going to just go with 30. And then after that, we go 15 and 15 and add up to the 60. So now I'm just giving it 30. Okay, so now I give it the first torque at 30 Newton meter, and we're checking the rotation of the crank, and it's still rotating nice, no resistance. Okay, so I've just finished give 30 Newton meter torque, and I rotate the crank, it rotating nice still. So now I'm going to go to 45, and we're slowly going up because we don't just want to go to 60 and either strip the thread or damage the bolt or something. So that's why you have to go at a small portion until you reach the limit. So now we have 45 on the torque wrench, 45 Newton meter. And with the torque wrench, you have to turn and time that sound. And soon as you hear it go click, immediate you stop and don't turn go any further. And you want to give one straight turn. So watch this one here. You're not going to turn, stop, and go back and turn, stop. You want to give one continuous turn until that click. And not just that, if you're reusing back old bolts, sometimes it can't go 60 Newton, it might can just go 58, 57. But you have to develop that feel in your hand where you know this bolt, if you go 1 inch further, it's going to break. So watch how I'm turning it this time. I'm going to go straight, and I'm not going to stop until I get that click, but I'm also feeling if the bolt start to reach its limit. Okay, so now we're going to adjust the torque wrench, and it's at 45 Newton meter now. We're going to go to the 60 Newton meter now. Okay, so I readjusted the torque wrench to 60 Newton meter, and now we're going to give it the final torque. But we gotta keep that feeling in their hand where if you can feel if the bolt can't handle that torque, because they're not brand new stuff. We're using about the same stuff. The same bolts actually. So I've just finished give the final torque at 60 Newton meter. Now I'm checking to see how the crankshaft rotating, and it feels beautiful. And remember, this is something going to rotate, 8,000 RPM, 5,000 RPM. And at the same time, I'm checking the end play, and it's close to 0. If you remember before, when we're pulling the engine down between here and here, you'd have a lot of play. And now when I move it, you can't even see anything. It just about, I'm thinking it's less than 1 thou right now, which is excellent. So that's one problem rectified already in terms of the crank area. It have a good feel to the end play. So now I'm going to just put the dial indicator on the crank, on the engine block on the crank, and check to see what the actual end play is. And that is to install the pistons and see the piston holding tool working beautiful, it's doing the job. It's not your expensive thing, it's just something you see that we made it up. It's simple, but it's getting the job done and getting it done effectively. We have a few tools because each phase of the repair we change out the tools, because we don't want too much tools just spread out over the place. So now we actually bring a rubber hammer, which we need this to knock the piston in. And we have the piston ring squeezer, and we'll need a torque wrench and a regular ratchet just to rotate the engine. The crank is in, and it's rotating good, and just about to put the pistons in. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and recommend it to a friend. And if you're in the neighborhood, feel free to stop by and have a conversation. Or if you just want to send us your question or comment, we will show a reply in our next video. Thanks again for watching.